Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of Forbes Women. Abortion and reproductive rights have been one of the most motivating factors in driving voters to the polls in the midterm elections, and they are poised to be one of the biggest issues in the 2024 presidential election. Here to explain exactly what's going on is Minnie Timmaraju. She is the president and CEO of Reproductive Freedom for All. Minnie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with a $100 million campaign that your organization is taking part in. It's called Abortion Access Now. And what is it?
This is an opportunity for 9 national reproductive rights, health, and justice organizations to come together and really make a historic investment in voter education, leading up to the election, but also building our grassroots momentum for a 2025 Congress so that we are equipped with the most robust and most organized and most activated membership across our orgs to really fight for federal legislation and be ready for, frankly, all the scenarios that we are mapping out, given all that's in flux politically in this country. So this is 9 organizations you've heard of, like Planned Parenthood and ACLU, but organizations you might not be as familiar with, like the National Women's Law Center, In Our Own Voice, National Asia Pacific Women's Forum. What we're trying to do here is bring together the breadth and the depth of the reproductive rights movement to really make sure we're approaching this from the most robust, expansive policy lens possible. And that means, in practical terms, that we're not just fighting for restoring a federal right to abortion, although that is critical, baseline. We got to get back to a right in all 50 states, but we're also fighting for expanded access to abortion care. Because for a long time in this country, even though Roe was the law of the land, in so many parts of the country, women, particularly women of color, women in rural areas, pregnant people who had a hard time making ends meet, didn't have access to care because of prohibitions on access, whether it was distance, whether it was cost. So we're really aiming for a very robust platform. And we know 8 out of 10 Americans now support abortion access and understand how vital it is for very unfortunate reasons, right? Because of Dobbs and the overturning of Roe. So how do we capitalize, unfortunately, on a very tragic situation to get the best, most robust policy possible in a place like Washington, D.C., which is a tough place?
It is a tough place. Now, $100 million is a lot of money. How are you and your cohort intending to spend this? Is this on advertising? Are you supporting candidates? What's the division of dollars here?
We are, this is a C3 and a C4 side campaign. The bulk of what we're doing right now is C3, and that 100 million represents money that's already been invested by many of our orgs that we've already committed to this fight, and some new money that we're raising for this work. So for an example, the types of things we're definitely doing digital ads, but we are not leading with digital ads. We're honestly leading with organizing. So a lot of these resources are going to our partners and our allies in states where we have a lot of critical grassroots mobilization to do, where our movement may have a thinner bench of organizations with members. We know that this has to be a people-powered movement, that we cannot rely on the whims of what's happening in Washington, D.C. We also know that to truly build long-term political power for our movement, it's about making sure our numbers are well represented in the variety of states, not just the states where we've been investing with ballot measures, or not just in battleground states where there's going to be a lot of airtime on abortion. But we've got to go to tougher places and tougher folks who don't get that information and educate them on the stakes. So it's a lot of voter education through digital and online organizing, a lot of actual boots on the ground, door to door, a lot of community, town halls, house parties, a lot of the old school tactics that are really vital to breaking through the noise, to really educate folks who are not getting the information in traditional ways.
I see. I was going to ask if this was part of a get out the vote measure in battleground states, and if some of the money was going, and then if some of the money was going to go towards the ballot measures, which we're seeing the petitions for the signatures in a few different states. But this sounds like it's supplementing those efforts.
That's right. It is. And the way that I would ask folks to think about it, the way I'd explain it is this is focused on a federal solution. So while many of our orgs are sitting at the tables and the campaigns in the states on ballot measures, and some of our orgs like us, Planned Parenthood, Emily's List, we have federal PACs, we endorse candidates. We can legally do that through our other mechanisms. This campaign is mostly focused on voter education and voter mobilization around a federal policy, a set of federal policy solutions to the crisis.
Federal policy. When it comes to federal policy on abortion and reproductive health care, it sounds like a tall order in this political environment. How likely are we to see a federal action here?
It's definitely a tough environment. I think it's still not outside of our grasp. We feel very confident about the stakes. Putting my hat as Reproductive Freedom for All for our PAC, I feel very confident in our stakes in our chances in the House of Representatives. We're working really closely with our friends in the D-Trip, and we've got enough targets in this country that are very, very close, where we feel very optimistic about the U.S. House. The Senate is tough, but the latest polls have most of our Senate battleground races ahead of President Biden, which is an important thing right now, and doing really well. And some of our toughest races in the U.S. Senate are in places where we have a lot of momentum around ballot measures: Arizona, Nevada, and then even in Montana. So, John Tester's running alongside a ballot measure. Ruben Gallego's running alongside a ballot measure. And then in places like Michigan and Ohio, you've had recent victories that have really mobilized voters around abortion. And you've got U.S. Senate candidates, Sherrod Brown, we're hoping Alyssa Slatkin, she's still in a primary, will be capitalizing on how holding the Senate is going to be critical to protecting those wins in those states. And then look, at the White House, we've been very clear that only a Biden-Harris administration can deliver on a federal right to abortion. That you need a pro-reproductive freedom trifecta, which I understand probably sounds unrealistic to a lot of people, but we're running to win. We believe abortion, and the data all shows it, that when it's on the ballot, it wins. So we need to make this election a clear contrast between Joe Biden and Donald Trump around abortion access. One candidate and one party wants to restore that right, and one candidate and one party want to rescind all the good work this administration has done, plus pass and sign a national abortion ban, despite what Donald Trump says. And it's really clear, and you mentioned Project 2025 when we started, so that's the blueprint that we really have to educate Americans on.
There's a lot to unpack there. I just want to go back to something you said. You said some of the candidates that the PAC has supported are polling ahead of Joe Biden. Why is that important? Are you making contingency plans in case he pulls out of the race and a different candidate steps in for the Democrats?
It's important. I'm so glad you asked me. We're not making contingency plans. All of our work is around a Joe Biden, Kamala Harris ticket. But I'm glad you asked me to clarify. Why I think it's important to note that the Senate candidates are running ahead of the president is, I'll be candid, there's a lot of doom and gloom right now in the Democratic, operative class here in Washington, D.C. When I'm in the states, what I'm hearing on the ground from my members, and I have 4 million members, and a lot of them in these battleground states, they're feeling optimistic, they're feeling confident, and it's showing up in how they're supporting and polling for these Senate races. So I trust the data of local folks thinking about who they're supporting for the Senate or in a ballot measure in the state legislature, more than I trust where they're at with Donald Trump and Joe Biden right now, when we know many folks are not yet dialed into the presidential, and quite frankly, where we know there's still a margin for us to make up in the presidential. So not about contingency plans, more about the really strong strength of these candidates, because I got a lot of folks in my ear saying, how can you count on the Senate? I'm like, look at how well they're doing.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned no matter what former President Trump says, there's only one candidate who will protect abortion rights. And I wanted to ask you about the RNC platform, because ahead of the convention next week, the RNC released its policy platform. And when it comes to reproductive health and abortion, a lot of the headlines used words like a dramatic shift and a softening in the RNC's historic position when it comes to abortion. It seems like they are moving away from federal limits or a federal ban on abortion based on some of the analysis of this platform. But Minnie, I want to ask, what do you make of the RNC platform and how it treats reproductive health?
Yeah, it's terrifying. So look, I think the American people are very familiar with Donald Trump's incredible talent at lying and kind of hiding the truth. A couple of things. First of all, Project 2025, which is the Heritage Foundation-led blueprint for a future Trump administration, despite his efforts to deny it, I mean, recent reporting today from CNN indicates over 25 plus authors and folks involved with Project 2025 were also Trump administration leaders. So they're entangled. They're all part of the same allied organizational infrastructure that a Biden administration will put forth. And, you mentioned the Supreme Court cases. What's really terrifying about the medication abortion and the emergency abortion care cases is the court didn't actually settle the law. They just punted the cases down the road. And then you look at Project 2025, and right there in plain writing is plans for a Trump admin to rescind those actions. So those were executive actions by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Going back to the platform, I was really disturbed to see the number of outlets that called it softening of language, because what the GOP did was really sneaky. They did not do their laundry list of bills that they've supported in the past. And they made a big show of having a public fight with some of the most extreme abortion activists in their party. But what they did do was put language that very clearly indicated that they support states invoking the 14th Amendment and applying it to embryos and fetuses. What that does is it basically creates a pathway for legislation that enshrines personhood for embryos. That is the basis for some of the most challenging, scary attacks on abortion, but also contraception and also IVF. The big Alabama case that everybody got really worked up about on IVF, that was based on personhood theology, personhood ideology. So that's the root of that movement. And at least a dozen or so anti-abortion leaders praised it openly. They weren't hiding it, that was actually a big deal for them. Because you think about this court and you think about states enacting rules like that, and you can say, leave it to the states, leave it to the states. States enact legislation like this, it goes to this court. And now we have a federal personhood decision from this Supreme Court. And that would just be endgame for contraception, IVF, and so many other reproductive technologies. And listen, that's always been what that movement has advocated for. And we can see it in the light of day. So excited that so many people caught it, disappointed in the narrative in the press, but it's our job as advocates to educate folks about this.
Now, we're talking both about the RNC platform and Project 2025, and this might feel like a really basic question, but for folks who are seeing headlines about both of these things, what is the difference between Project 2025 and the RNC platform?
Yeah, I mean, the difference is that the RNC platform is the, quote, official on the record policy that the party has adopted. But really, in a year where you have a incumbent, and for all intents and purposes, Donald Trump is functioning as an incumbent in this situation, it is the president's message. And Donald Trump, I think, is smart to make the message seem more moderate and palatable. But what Project 2025 is actually a lot more powerful. And look, Democrats have their own versions of this too, right? You have allied groups that support the president that put out their policy platforms like ours, and you have those organizations endorsing or supporting that candidate, right? So every side has this. So if you line up Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and their equivalent organizations putting out platforms like Project 2025, they match very clearly what a Biden-Harris administration has done. And that is how you know what's accurate. When you look at Project 2025 and you look at the Trump administration and who he appointed and what he did in office, not what the GOP platform says, his campaign mandate, but what he actually did. And that is our message. Look at what Donald Trump did, not what he's saying through the GOP platform now, but what the folks who ran his admin did. They overturned Roe, and it was in that blueprint. So believe it when they say they're going to do it again.
What specifically in Project 2025 in the writing most concerns you?
What's the most concerning and what's created a lot of alarm is alternative ways for them to ban abortion without Congress. We do everything we can to fight back and win back the House. Hopefully, and I feel very confident, hold the Senate. We lose the White House. What that does and what Project 2025 sets up is we don't actually need Congress to do these things. Because one of the things I hear often at the doors is, well, Trump can't do that because he's not going to have Congress, right? Or he won't have a supermajority in the Senate, and they won't be able to pass a national ban. And Trump himself has said things like that to the press, like, well, I'm not going to even be able to pass that. Well, Project 2025 reveals how by using things like the Comstock Act, an antiquated 1800s anti-obscenity law that was used to prohibit abortion access by mail, they can shut down abortion pills by mail. It also talks about rescinding approval of medication abortion, a case that was in front of the Supreme Court that they punted on. Medication abortion is the most popular and most effective and most accessible an affordable way for abortion care in this country, and it's used in the majority of all abortions in the country. So we call those efforts backdoor abortion bans. And it also calls on rescinding the Biden era, EMTALA rule, which was the rule that allowed for emergency care in abortion cases, where it would save the life of the pregnant person. So there's a lot of stuff like that that's damaging. And then there's a lot of stuff that's just silly and inflammatory, but it indicates how serious these folks are. Like changing HHS to the Department of Life, getting rid of the Gender Policy Council, removing all language about abortion from key administration documents and executive orders. It seems silly, but it's quite chilling when you think about the zeal in which they want to just erase abortion from the federal landscape. And it indicates that these are not folks who are like 8 out of 10 Americans. These are zealots who have extremist views that are wildly out of step with the United States of America.
You mentioned the Comstock Act, and I want to ask, because we're in this moment 4 months out from the general election. Joe Biden is still the commander-in-chief at this point in time. Is there any effort to repeal the Comstock Act while Biden is in office and before the election? Because this keeps coming up in the interviews I've been doing around abortion and reproductive health care, and the concern that this 19th century law, this 1800s law, could affect the way people get reproductive care in 2024.
Absolutely. So Senator Tina Smith has a bill she's filed. I think there's going to be a House companion filed soon. Senate Democrats and House Democrats are working on a pathway to to repeal Comstock. Of course, they don't have the majorities yet to do so, but they are getting ready to do that. And when I talked about Abortion Access Now and our coalition to get ready for a federal trifecta, if we win the House and the Senate, we don't win the White House, we're still going to be pushing for every single piece of legislation and force Donald Trump to veto it.
Now, I just said we're 4 months out from the general election. We just saw a few Supreme Court decisions on abortion cases, but they've released all the decisions they can for the time being. It kind of feels like we're in, I don't know if we would call it a quiet period or a purgatory, but July's a weird time for decision making, if you will. So what's your mandate right now? How are you thinking about this moment in time?
So in light of even though we had the 2 abortion cases where they effectively punted back to lower courts and said we're not going to really deal with the underlying question, right? We are very active. We joined several court reform coalitions and we started lobbying on court reform. I think with the Chevron case and the immunity case, there's a larger discussion about not just abortion and reproductive freedom, but our very democratic institutions. How much overreach can the executive branch have? How much power are we giving the judiciary over the executive branch, over administration? How much power are we giving the president? So some of what I talked earlier about how a lot of what we're doing as an organization, Reproductive Freedom for All, but also Abortion Access Now, is going to be focused on organizing. Because no matter what, we have to make sure our grassroots movement is empowered with this information, not only for the election, but also for what comes after the election, also for fighting back, joining citizen lobby efforts to expand the court, to have stricter ethics for the court. We need stronger citizen action around the host of issues around democracy, voting rights. We don't get back to real representative democracy, which is frankly, the challenge of reproductive freedom, but also so many other issues that progressives care about, whether it's gun violence, whether it's climate change. These are all issues that the majority of Americans support, reforms for, and yet we haven't been able to get past the gridlock. So we've got to keep making sure that our activists and our base, the majority of Americans, have access to democratic levers of power. So we're really focused on getting out the vote, but also continuing to build real political power throughout this country.
Minnie Timmaraju, thank you so much for explaining all of this to us, and I hope to have you back as the election season continues.
Happy to be there. Happy to be back, and it's so good to chat with you.